The text for the sermon this morning is the Word of God, as we have summarized it and confessed it as church in Lord's Day 4 of our Heidelberg Catechism. And if you'd like to read along in a book of praise, Lord's Day 4 can be found on page 520 of your books of praise. So this is, Lord's Day 4 is the last Lord's Day in a short section that is what we consider the first part of the Heidelberg Catechism, which is dealing with our sin and our misery. And so we will now read this last Lord's Day in that section. So this is your confession. Question 9. But does not God do man an injustice by requiring in his law what man cannot do? Answer, no, for God so created man that he was able to do it. But man, at the instigation of the devil, in deliberate disobedience, robbed himself and all his descendants of these gifts. Question, will God allow such disobedience and apostasy to go unpunished? Answer, certainly not. He is terribly angry with our original sin as well as our actual sins. Therefore, he will punish them by a just judgment, both now and eternally, as he has declared, "Cursed be everyone who does not abide by all the things written in the book of the law and do them." Galatians 3:10. Question, but is God not also merciful? Answer, God is indeed merciful, but he is also just. His justice requires that sin committed against the most high majesty of God also be punished with the most severe, that is, with everlasting punishment of body and soul. This is our confession. Brothers and sisters in our Lord Jesus Christ, we've been working our way through the Heidelberg Catechism and looking at how great our sin and misery is as we think about the comfort of belonging to Jesus Christ, the joy of that comfort of belonging to Jesus Christ. We need to understand how great our sin and misery is. And we've been looking at that with this sort of understanding that knowing our sin and misery is like a homesickness, and knowing that we're not home. That home is this place where we are what God created us to be, what he meant and made us to be, where we love him, where we love each other. We know that we're not there, that God created us to be there, but that we fell into sin and that we're far from home. And there's a longing in our heart to get back home. Now, as we think about what it means to be far from home and have that longing for home, there is another dimension that we need to pay some more attention to. And that is that as homesick travelers in this life, we not only know that we're not home, we also know the story, but we also need to know God. And you may think, well, we're going to be covering territory we've already gone over. We've been talking about God. All of this is about God. But we have to realize that if someone has an underdeveloped awareness, an understanding of who God is within the whole thing, within this idea of justice and right and wrong and sin and in misery, that if we don't have a proper knowing of God, then our homesickness gets a little misdirected and misaligned. It becomes a burden. It saps our joy. It saps the joy that's to be had in the comfort of knowing that we've been delivered from sin by Jesus Christ. And this failing to really reckon with God in dealing with right and wrong and with sin came home to me recently. On the recommendation of another pastor, I watched a television program. I'm not sure if you call them television programs anymore when they're on Netflix, but it was a show about a bunch of people who had died and were trying to get to a good place, the good place. And it was most certainly not a Christian show. But it was very clear that they had put a lot of work into asking the questions. It was actually a brilliant expression of contemporary, of our culture working through the ideas of what it means to be good and how good you need to be in a good place. If there's a version of this, whatever, from a non-Christian perspective, from our culture's perspective, they look at the world and they say, if there's a version of this story that includes some type of afterlife, and that somehow our behavior will impact that, they're working through what does good look like and what would the good place be like. And what struck me most as I watched the program, and it gave me a deep sense of sadness, was the complete absence of God in the question. That all of the working out of morality, all the working out of what good is and what bad is and what the good place is going to be like and what would make the good place a place you want to be, did not have anything of the presence of God. It was fascinating, even though this show was meant to be is a comedy, the episodes included lectures, essentially lectures, the characters going through lectures, a course on morality and ethics, and you would be interacting. So as somebody who studied theology and philosophy in seminary, it was fascinating. They were interacting with the moral imperative of Immanuel Kant, of Aristotle, Kierkegaard, Camus, Sartre, Nietzsche. They were seriously interacting with this, and they were working it out, and they were doing a pretty good job. But God was not there. They wanted to go to the good place. They wanted that good place to be their home, and they wanted to figure out how to get there. They really wanted to get there, but absent it at all was any consideration of the existence of a God and coming to terms with what that whole question would mean if it was all centered around, if the good place and being a good person was centered around the existence of a good God, of a good and loving and magnificent and awesome God. When we think about sin, when we think about the consequences of sin, if we remove God from the equation, what we end up with is a bunch of rules, a bunch of things that you need to do. And God sort of imposes this religious category on top of it. He becomes the one who's like, be good or you go to hell. He's the ultimate rule enforcer, the ultimate motivator to make people try and be good. And what happens is that when we look at sin and misery without considering God, or when our understanding of good and a good place is impacted by the world around us, we begin to see God as an imposition on us, as someone who has made cruel rules to follow. And we don't realize the depths of what sin and misery actually is, and then what he did. Lord's Day 4 interacts with the question of sin, but it does so with God right in the middle. If you look at the questions and you look at the answers. Question 9, is God fair? Question 10, is God just? Question 11, is God merciful? Our confession is considering sin in the context of knowing the character of God. And this is something that can be lost in the conversation when we talk about sin and our misery, and it can actually rob us of the joy of belonging to Jesus Christ. Because what happens, we view sin as a problem to be got round or out of or forgotten, rather than a problem that must be gone through. that must be dealt with because of what it is, and because of who God is, and because of who we are. So the joy and the comfort of belonging to Jesus Christ means knowing sin in relation to God and from God's perspective, His perspective on Himself and on us. So that's what we're going to do this morning. What we're going to see is that the homesick traveler, knows God. And we're going to see God's unrelenting love, His unfailing justice, and His uncompromising mercy. So, God's unrelenting love. When you look at question 9 begins with interacting with sin from this perspective. The question is, but does not God do man an injustice by requiring in the law what man cannot do? It actually sounds like a pretty good question. How can you expect a paralyzed person to walk? We've already confessed, we've looked at Scripture, and we've seen that we are inclined in our very hearts to go against God, to not obey the law, but yet God says you still have to obey it. It's like asking a blind person to see and being upset with them. Why can't you read the sign? Well, I'm blind. It doesn't matter, read the sign. And if you don't, so how is God being fair to human beings by demanding that they be perfect and sinless? How could a good God do that? And underneath the question is this understanding that diminished capacity requires diminished expectations, which in some cases will be true and right and fair. But what about someone who deliberately and willfully diminishes their capacity to do something? So to put it in another way, for students in school, imagine you were given work to do for school. And I have to be careful because with Zoom and with Classroom online, I know this is a bigger problem, and so I want to be careful how we put this, but you're given a whole bunch of work by your teacher, and you don't do any of it. And then at the end of the year or the term or the whatever quadmester, you have a test or an exam. And you look at the test and you say to your teacher, I don't know any of this. I can't do this. You need to adjust the test. Like, I'm never going to be able to pass this. So you need to adjust the test. It's not fair. And Article 9 points out that that's really what this question is asking. Yeah, we have diminished ourselves. We have thrown ourselves into sin. We're not able to do it anymore, and now we expect God to lower the requirement. You can think about Genesis 3 and the fall into sin. You think of Genesis 1 first with the creation, and that's what question or answer 9 points out. No, we were created to be able to do this. God created us good in His image. We were able to love God, love our neighbors, ourselves, and then deliberately, yes, at the instigation of the devil, but deliberately, in willful disobedience, human beings, Adam and Eve, our first parents, disobeyed God, and they lost that gift. They lost that ability. We read Romans 1 earlier. Romans 1:21 says it this way: although they knew God, they did not honor Him as God or give thanks to Him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Rejecting God, human beings became futile in their thinking. Their hearts were darkened. God gave them over to themselves. They made themselves less. They made themselves unable to obey God. But when you know who God is, you know He won't do what being suggested, that he will not lower the bar. When you know God, you know that God's righteous requirement of perfect righteousness in us means that he is not letting us become less than we are, less than what he meant and made us to be. That's both daunting for us, but also beautiful. Do you understand that? What we're confessing here is, yeah, we diminished our capabilities, our capacities to actually follow God's law. But God did not say, I'm going to accept that. He said, no, I created you beautiful. I created you and it was very good. And I want that. I don't want what you've made yourself. I want you, as I created you to be, able to love. Love me, love each other. His love is unrelenting. And really think about it. If we go back to the example of the student that didn't do the work, and the teacher adjusted the test for the student so that, what you didn't learn, the test was made to fit what you didn't know. Might work out nice for the student, you would think. But what does it mean about the teacher? Does that teacher care about the student? Now, students, if you're here today and you were thinking, I would love to have that teacher, you're wrong. If you have a teacher who does not care that you don't actually know what you need to know, that adjusts things because of how you have willfully made yourself unable to do what you should have been able to do, that teacher cares nothing for you. They just want to get through with you. They just want you to be, go through this thing and be gone. I don't have to deal with you anymore. Hey, and you know what? You might like me. I'll be the cool teacher. And it'll be less work. There'll be no complaining. But that's not our hope. Our hope is not in changing standards. That's not the hope of the gospel. No, that somehow we'll feel better about ourselves because things have been adjusted for what we've made ourselves. It came home to me since I've come to Ebenezer. I've gained weight, and I noticed it. I tried to do my suit jacket up a couple of years ago, and it only came to here. And I tried to blame it on the cleaner suit jacket, but no, I've been gaining weight. But watch this. It's impressive. No problems. New suit jacket. Problem solved. I tried to wear a tie the other day. I didn't even know that you can gain weight up here. So if you see me wearing a tie, it might mean I bought new shirts. But the ideal from my family's perspective was, you should lose weight, Dad. Then your suit will fit you. But I adjusted the requirement for myself. Now I can feel pretty good about myself. The other day, one of my kids told me that I was eating a pizza at 11 o'clock, and hey, keep doing that, you can buy another suit jacket. We can deliberately make ourselves less, and it's not good for us. And God says, I love you, and I'm not letting that stand. Our hope is not to be found in God expecting less of us, allowing us to be less than He meant and made us to be. God will not shrink His love to fit our smallness. His love is unrelenting. The demand remains. And that God does this, and that God even does this, proclaims the gospel of who God is and the reality of His relationship with us. You see that with Jeremiah 27. It sounds like such a horrible passage There's these prophets who are just encouraging the people, hey, don't worry, you're going to get through this. It's going to be over really soon. Stuff's coming back. Don't submit to the king of Babylon. And Jeremiah, the prophet of the Lord, is coming in and say, no, God has said he's going to punish you, and that's what he's doing. You're going into exile. It's going to last 70 years. He tells them everything. You've rejected the Lord. You've fallen short of what he's called you to be. But in the very act of Jeremiah speaking to Israel, there is gospel. God saying, I still love you, and I have not shrunk my love to fit you, and I have not just moved on past you. Think about how horrible it would be for Israel if God said nothing, that they did all of this wickedness and there was a resounding silence from God. God says, no, you're my people. And I told you, you're in this relationship with me and I'm calling you to be this. You're not. And now this is what happens. The covenant remains, this relationship that God has. God hasn't abandoned them. And then there's hope at the end. Hope of restoration. The temple and temple worship will be restored. But not by God lowering the bar. Judgment comes and then restoration. And that shows the reality of God's relationship with us. Because have you ever thought about what it would have been for God to just say, well, let's just hit reset. Let's restart this thing. Adam and Eve messed up. We'll try it again. Like just erase them and go back in time, or start with somebody else. Just destroy them and we'll start with somebody fresh. He didn't leave them alone. He didn't start over. He didn't say it's going to be too much work. I'm not just going to walk away from them. He could have done that. To use illustrations from social media. As a parent of teens in today's world, I'm learning technology terms. Ghosting. I had heard the term ghosting. I see young people laughing at me because you probably know what I thought when you ghosted somebody, that meant that you were kind of like haunting them, like you were sort of following them, and you could see them on Facebook and posting, but you never interacted with them. You were like following them, but invisible, like a ghost. Apparently that's called stalking. Ghosting means you're in a conversation with somebody and you just stop. Like you don't delete their account, you don't unfriend them or whatever, or unfollow them, but you're just not there. Another term, cancel. Everybody's heard that phrase, cancel culture, but if you cancel somebody, you basically say, I don't like this person, boop, delete, gone, unfriend, unfollow, let them know about it. Think about God in terms of us. God didn't ghost us. God didn't cancel us, which he had every right to do, and which would have been so much easier for him. But his love is unrelenting. And that unrelenting love means that God's going to find another way forward, and that way forward is daunting. It means that somehow we have to be what he meant and made us to be. That the righteous requirement remains, that God has something in store for us, and it somehow involves continuity with our pre-fall state, that the gospel is going to travel that route. And when the homesick traveler walks this route, knowing God, they see this unrelenting love of God in the requirement of righteousness. We have been delivered, but it's not by making the bar lower. So when you think about God's demands, when you think about the law, and you think, why does God make us do all this? You say, because I love you so much, I will not let you be less. And then our confession continues to ask another question about God, and we see there God's unfailing justice. It says, will God allow such disobedience and apostasy to go unpunished? It's really asking, would God really punish sinners with eternal hell and condemnation? Is hell real? Will my unbelieving friend go to hell if they don't believe? If I don't believe, will I go to hell if I don't live for God perfectly? How can God be good and loving if He would do that? Yeah, He said it, but will He actually do it? There is a sense of hoping that God wouldn't do, that He would allow this sin, this disobedience and apostasy to continue. That's really what the people of Judah were thinking in Jeremiah 27. If you look ahead to Jeremiah 28, there are prophets like Hananiah who were saying that it's all going to be okay. God's punished us, but that's over. Everything will be better soon. They were thinking and hoping that God wouldn't do what He had actually said He would. And they're saying, no, that's not who God is. We're God's people. Yeah, He's upset, but He's been upset with us before. It's going to be okay. They had this sense that God would favor them because they were His people. The prophets in the Old Testament expose this thinking, and Paul confronts it in Romans 1 and 2. The Gentiles sin and they receive punishment. That's good. That's what the Jews say. But Israel gets the same. That's unexpected. They thought their sin would be ignored because they were God's people. But if you read all of Romans 1 and 2, which I didn't do today because it would have been great, but it'll take a lot of time. If you look at Romans 1 and 2, you see that what Paul's doing is he's saying, yeah, there's the Gentiles sin and they'll be judged under the law. But Jews, they'll be judged without the law. Jews, you're under the law, you think you're better, but you don't do it. You're also unrighteous. The wrath of God's coming for you too. Paul talks about sin. He talks about the sin of the Gentiles, how they exchange the glory of God, worship false gods. He talks about the sins of idolatry, adultery, lying, gossiping, disobedience to parents. But then he shifts his attention to Israel, telling them that they judge those sins, but they themselves are just as bad when it comes to those sins. The message is about all of us being sinners. All of us have disobeyed God, fall short of the glory of God, the glory that God has for us. We're all sinners, and sin needs to be dealt with because God is a just God. And that means we have to kind of get our minds around sin again. We've talked about it before, but sin is not just about a mistake. Sin is rebellion. But at its core, sin is saying, I reject God and I look for everything that God has promised or things that God has allowed me to have. I look for it in other things. I want more, or I want different than what He has promised. When we expect or even demand that God will only be good and just if He does not punish sin, we're saying that God is not everything that He thinks He is. Do you ever think about it that way? Maybe you've had that as a son or a daughter where your father, your mother has been upset with you. And you're like, get over yourself. Like, it was just whatever. Like, so I said that to you. What? Like, you're going to hold that over me? You think that's who you are? That's how important you think you are? What you have is a fundamental disagreement with that person over actually who they are and how important they are and how much they matter. And when we say that sin doesn't matter and it doesn't deserve punishment or justice, you're saying that you value yourself or others more than Him. We're familiar with this. It's something that's coming. We're hearing it more, and it's actually in so many ways a good thing, where in the past you've had issues of abuse and harassment where the abuser has been allowed to continue and the one who has been abused is told to be quiet. is told to go away. Is told to not make a fuss. What's being said? If you're a victim of abuse and you're here today, I'm sorry if that's happened to you. Because what somebody's told to you, what somebody's told you is they've said, we think less of you. And this person's more important. You're gonna compromise this person. Yeah, I know the stuff that's happened to you, that's bad. But this is more important. When you say to God, it is somehow not right for you to judge sin, you're saying to Him, I don't think that what we did to you actually is that bad. And if God would agree with you, He would make Himself less. But His justice is unfailing as His love is unrelenting. And the truth is that sin will be punished. It is a horrible thing. It is a slap in the face to the Creator, the good, perfect, loving, gracious Creator of heaven and earth. It's a rejection of the good that He is. It's an embracing of sin and evil and wickedness. And hell is a place of eternal separation from God, the God that you actually hate. It's a place where those who do not want God in their lives will live without God in their lives. But it's also a place where God will not give His love, but will give His anger. A just anger that's rooted in a completely true and accurate love of Himself. And we want God to be that. And the homesick traveler knows God's unfailing justice and loves God so much and says that you are magnificent, you are beautiful, you hate evil. You will not allow it to stand. You will never say, that was evil, but you are less. You will never say, that was evil, a sin against you, and you're less. He will never look at evil and say, that was sin against me, but I'm less. His justice is unfailing. That's the God we know. So whatever deliverance is going to look like, it's going to go through the pathway of justice. It means it's going to deal with sin, go through sin, not get out of sin, not hope that sin gets forgotten about. It's going to be a way through that is unfailingly faithful to God's perfect righteousness and justice, and will not permit a lessening of God's holiness and His glory that is His, both rightfully and necessarily. The road that Scripture takes, and which the homesick traveler follows, is the route that follows God's unfailing justice, God's character and His glory. And the homesick traveler says, I don't know how to take that road. But the gospel is that God found a way. And then finally, it's about uncompromising mercy. The confession asks, question 11, but is God not also merciful? The question looks for comfort in God's mercy, but it looks to do so in a way that undermines justice, but which also then compromises mercy. The idea is that if God is so loving and merciful, wouldn't that part of Him win over against His justice and His anger? It's sort of like you take the two, and it's like this conflict between God's mercy and His justice. And it's like we say, let them fight, and we'll see who wins. And what happens, and you see that mercy wins, and justice is thrown down in defeat. But that mercy that emerges from that kind of battle is a compromise mercy. It's an arbitrary mercy. It's a mercy that was won not because it was rightfully yours, but because of somebody just saying, I guess, or, hey, it's okay. It's a mercy that is not rooted in something actually being done and it having a solidity. The mercy that wins in that case is fickle and unstable. It came out of nowhere and it could go into nowhere. You might have that with a relationship where all of a sudden one day they're like, oh yeah, that's fine. And then the next day, no, that's not fine. God's not like that. His mercy is uncompromised. So what that means is that He has said the way forward is not going to be that I will have mercy without justice, but that I will have mercy with justice. Jeremiah 27, He had mercy with justice. He sent them into exile in His unfailing love, in His unrelenting love, and His unfailing justice. He says, I will bring you back. Uncompromised mercy, pointing ahead to the way He would save in Jesus Christ. And what you see in the cross, we're going to start looking at deliverance next time. We're going to be looking ahead to the cross. But when you see the cross, you see God's justice and mercy in one place. We see that God's going to find a way forward in His unrelenting love, in His unfailing justice, and His uncompromising mercy. It's the wonder of God's love in Jesus Christ. And when we come to terms with our sin and our misery, we know that whatever deliverance there's going to be, it will not make God less, not make us less, and it will not be arbitrary. It will not be cheap. It will not be pretty. It will not be painless. It will be messy, painful, costly, and yet magnificently beautiful. It will be a deliverance that once gotten through and is complete, it will be perfect and just. One that is unrelentingly committed to our original creational righteousness and purpose and will not be satisfied with a diminished us. One that is unfailingly faithful to God's perfect righteousness and justice and will not permit a lessening of God's holiness and the glory that is rightfully and necessarily His. And one that is uncompromisingly defined by a mercy that will show a love undiminished or compromised. A love that does not compromise either us or God. It will be a deliverance we can't quite get our minds around and which will need more explaining. But that's what the next section of the Heidelberg Catechism is for. The bar is set high. Now we get to meet the one who's able to make it. Amen. Let's now sing in response to the proclamation of the gospel. We'll sing Psalm 17, stanza 6.